tonight's debate organized by Mindwise and Studium Generale. My name is Valeria. I am a student in the Neuroscience Research Master, and together with Tassos, who is lecturer at the Psychology Department, will be moderating this event.
It's really wonderful to have this luxury problem of having a very full house today, so I'm really happy to see all of you here. As Valeria said, we're both members of the Psychology Department, and further, we are both members of Mindwise, which is the science communication or the public engagement branch of the Psychology Department. And what we aim to do is to showcase the education and the research work that happens in our department, share the stories of our students and staff members, and bring the topic of psychology, science, and academia closer to the public sphere. And it is with these aims also that we've been organizing these debates with Studium Generale for the last couple of years. And it's a format that we're really happy with. It's very lively, and it brings together staff members and students from the university and facilitates discussions on interesting, current, risky, and informative topics.
Tonight's event has two parts. So the first part is a formal debate that will unfold according to the Karl Popper debating format. And this will be followed by a discussion with the audience where everyone is invited to contribute their ideas or ask questions to any of the speakers. We would like to emphasize that the positions that will be argued for by both of the teams are extreme intentionally, because we want to create a clear picture of the opposites of this topic, but there is of course space for a lot of nuance in between. So hopefully we'll reach that nuance in the discussion, but the positions supported in the formal part are not necessarily in line with speakers' personal or professional stance on this subject.
Today, the topic that our debaters are going to be talking about is related to mental disorders and neuroscience, and in particular, the specific proposition that is going to be discussed is, can neuroscience make the diagnosis of mental disorders objective? And we have two teams of staff members and students who are going to be taking part in this debate. So arguing for the proposition is the team to my right and to your left, and this is a team that comprises Valentina Lozano, who is a PhD student from environmental psychology. We have Johanna Dinkelacker, who is a research master in the behavioral and cognitive neuroscience program. And we have Andre Alleman, who is professor of cognitive neuroscience at the university and at the UMCG. And to my left and to your right is the team arguing against this proposition, against the idea that neuroscience can provide objectivity in clinical diagnosis. And it's a team that comprises Marcus Aronen, who is assistant professor in the Department of History and Theory of Psychology. We have Tom Jalling, who is a student of psychology. And we have Zander Vallewein.
Sure.
I always forget one name as I get through this, who is a master's student in psychology in the program of Reflecting on Psychology. Before starting with this part of the debate, which is the formal part of the debate, I would like to ask you to refrain from applauding our debaters after each of their speeches. We will all have a chance to applaud their contributions at the end of this formal part and before we start the discussion with the audience. I remind also the speakers that we will give them very clear indications of the passage of time and when their time is up. And we will begin today's debate by having the team arguing for the proposition. But before we do this, I think it would be very good if everybody welcomes the speakers and the debaters with a very warm round of applause. We hope you enjoy this event, and we begin with the team arguing for the proposition with Valentina Lozano.
Thank you. I am very happy to have the opportunity to discuss a topic that, as it is evident from how many people are here, is of extreme societal relevance. Have you ever felt that you have no motivation, that your energy is low, that you have no interest in your activities, and life is just hard? I guess you have. Well, let me tell you that these symptoms are related to both clinical depression and having a flu. In fact, I think we can all recognize that, especially in the aftermath, when you have been really sick and you're still recovering, you just wander around purposeless, with low energy, no motivation, which is a huge overlap with the symptoms of clinical depression. Yet, I bet it doesn't even cross your mind that you have such a mental disorder. And this shows that very different causes can lead to an almost identical manifestation in terms of symptoms, which raises the question, are symptoms enough to draw reliable conclusions about what's going on? Before entering our arguments, I would like to set some context for them. And I'd like to draw your attention to the proposition at my back. And first of all, I'd like to draw the attention to the last word, namely objective. As humans, no matter how much effort we put into grasping a reality in a totally impartial manner, we cannot get rid of our subjectivity. Nothing is as objective as the fact that reality is and will always be filtered by our perceptions. So I'd like to stress here that pure and absolute objectivity is nothing but an utopian goal. So what does objective mean? Well, for the purposes of this debate, we propose that objectivity in neuroscience is achieved when different researchers come to the same conclusion, which is based on observable and measurable evidence without applying personal opinion. Another aspect that deserves attention is the modal verb in the proposition, can. Such word doesn't refer to the present state of the matter, but to the future potential. In fact, if I say, I can run a marathon, it doesn't necessarily assume that I already did it. And the fact that I didn't doesn't necessarily, in principle, falsify that I can. But let's talk about diagnosis. So how is someone diagnosed, say, with diabetes? Well, the person goes to see a physician based on a set of symptoms, right? Frequent urination, unusual thirst, change in appetite. And the doctor, based on his expertise and on the patient's symptoms, might well immediately think about a diagnosis of diabetes. Yet, in order to confirm such diagnosis, the patient is invited to take a blood test. What is that blood test? Well, it provides the observable and measurable evidence for the diagnosis, on which there is wide consensus in the medical community, and that it's independent from the opinion of the individual physician. In other words, it makes the diagnosis objective. And what about the diagnosis of mental disorders, such as schizophrenia, depression? Well, also in this case, the person goes to see an expert based on certain symptoms. But in this case, the diagnostic process is widely based on the subjective evaluation of the symptoms. In fact, on the one side, the patient is asked to self-report answers to questions about the frequency and the severity of certain symptoms. Yet research shows that people are not very accurate when it comes to self-evaluating their symptoms, especially when they have to think about the past. On the other side, the results of such self-reported questionnaires are then assessed by different specialists. And it might happen, and it does happen, that the different specialists conclude different diagnoses. And what about the patient's brain? The link between psychological states and brain's physiology is widely acknowledged. So why shouldn't we include such an angle in the diagnosis of mental disorders? Wouldn't it be desirable to have a confirmation of the diagnosis of a mental disorder through objectivity, as in the example of diabetes? Our answer is affirmative. Thank you.
So it is the turn of the opposition to cross-examine Valentina.
Yes. I would want to start with getting a few elaborations on a few things that you've said. So, at some point, you acknowledge that there is not a absolute objectivity at this point in time, and then you were talking about us having to keep the future in mind. Yes, what would you like to say?
Those are separate things. So on the
in
one
what way?
side, there is no pure objectivity, and on the other side, we are talking about not how things are, but also how things can be.
And then, what, in your view, would have to change in the near future for us to actually then have this objectivity in diagnosis? Because I think you acknowledge that it's not our current situation completely.
Yes. But do you link it to are you linking it
No,
to the
I've
pure and
taken-
absolute objectivity? No.
I've not taken this separately.
Okay. Well, I don't think it's a matter of changing. It's a matter of giving time for the technologies and the studies to develop. So we are still in an early stage of the neuroscientific discoveries in terms of biomarkers, for instance, of mental disorders, and on the fact that people with the same symptomatic profile have very different patterns in terms of brain physiology.
Yes.
So for me, it's not about changing, it's about giving time
Okay.
at this moment.
And developing these technologies in order for us to, for example, find these biomarkers.
Yes.
At some point, you raised the clear connection between a physician and a psychologist in this sense, so diagnosing diabetes, for example, and diagnosing depression. What about second opinion in a clinic, in hospitals and stuff? If this is actually an example of us being able to use real objective measurements in the hospital, then why do we have second opinions?
Why do we have what? Sorry?
Second opinions for a diagnosis in a physical hospital.
Well, I think, what do you mean by second opinions?
So you can get a diagnosis as a patient, and then you can kind of not agree with this diagnosis, and you can ask for a second opinion.
In the case of diabetes?
Yeah, for example.
Okay.
If getting a diabetes diagnosis is an example of objective measurement, objective evidence, then why do we have second opinions?
Yeah, I guess
A very quick answer, please.
because it is still good to know that you're not making a mistake.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. We continue with the opening statement from the team against the proposition that is given by Marcus Aronen.
Okay, thank you. So, dear opponents, dear audience, I do think that neuroscientific research into mental disorders is scientifically valuable and useful, but I do not think that it makes the diagnosis of mental disorders objective. And I will now give 3 reasons for why I think this is the case. First, in contrast to what is often thought, the neuroscientific methods such as neuroimaging are not more scientific and more objective than psychological methods. The use of very sophisticated technology such as fMRI scanners may give this impression, but a closer look at the evidence shows that this is actually not the case. It is important to remember that none of the available methods actually measure brain activity directly. For example, fMRI scanners, they measure tiny differences in blood flow between groups of people, and to get from those tiny differences into the pretty pictures that we see in newspapers or journals, you need a lot of steps, a lot of pre-processing, processing, analysis, involving many debatable assumptions at each step. So many things can go wrong in that process. And to show how this can go wrong, some years ago, as an experiment, researchers put a dead salmon, a dead fish, in an fMRI scanner and look what happens. And to their surprise, they actually detected cognitive activity in the dead fish. Of course, that's not what's supposed to happen. But there's also more systematic evidence for why neuroimaging research is not always very reliable. For example, in a recent study, the same hypothesis was tested in different neuroimaging fMRI labs to see whether they converge or find the same result, which would be, of course, desirable. But in fact, the different labs came to different conclusions. Some of them found evidence for the hypothesis, some of them found evidence against it, and others found something in between. And there's also other studies, for example, meta-analyses that look at a whole bunch of neuroimaging studies from the past and compare them to see how much overlap there is. And it turns out that the same cognitive function can be associated with many different brain areas in different studies. So it seems that actually, even though we think that cognitive neuroscience is somehow more reliable or better than psychological research, the evidence doesn't really support this. So I now move on to the second reason why I think that neuroscience doesn't make diagnosis more objective. And that is that even if neuroimaging research did produce somehow solid and reliable results, it would still not be relevant at all for diagnosing and treating people with mental disorders. The reason for this is that what seems to be crucial for diagnosing and treating people is the psychological symptoms. For example, depression is defined and diagnosed based on psychological things such as feeling sad, feeling guilty, having negative thoughts, finding it difficult to decide, and so on. And if somebody has none of those symptoms, then that person is simply not depressed, no matter what the brain scans show. So imagine that I'm feeling completely happy, I have no symptoms at all, not feeling sad, but I go to a routine checkup at the doctor, and the doctor puts me in a brain scanner and says, I'm sorry, but the scan shows that you are depressed. What should I do? Should I accept it? Okay, I guess I must be depressed then. Well, of course not, because that is not what depression is about. This is, of course, an extreme example, but also more broadly speaking, it's hard to see what added value the neuroimaging results have to psychological assessments that we make. In the end, the whole validity of these neuroimaging results has to be checked and tested based on the psychological assessments. And if there's no correspondence between the neuroimaging stuff and the kind of general well-being of people, the psychological well-being of patients and other people, then these neuroimaging results are not very valuable. So it's clear that psychology leads here. Mental disorders are simply not defined based on neuroscience, but based on psychological symptoms. And this is not just due to some current limitations in our knowledge, but it is due to the very nature of these disorders. So this brings me to my third point. It is true that current ways of assessing and classifying mental disorders based on psychology are not always perhaps very reliable or objective, but this is no reason to turn to neuroscience. We can also try to make those psychological categories better based on psychological science. And actually much progress is being made in this field. For example, due to developments in technology, it is now possible to measure people over time. For example, with apps in smartphones, you can ask people to track their symptoms over time, over days, weeks, or even months, which gives us interesting information about how the disorders unfold over time. It also allows us to look for interesting social triggers or new explanations for what makes people relapse into a depression, for example. And such methods are actually already in use, also here in Groningen at the UMCG, and they are perceived as very useful by both therapists, patients, and researchers. So this approach, which is just one example of how we can proceed to make psychological classifications better, it doesn't rely on neuroimaging or neuroscience at all, and doesn't need it. So in light of these points, it is rather unfortunate that a disproportionate amount of research funding goes into neuroimaging studies to mental disorders, which are actually extremely expensive compared to psychological studies, but have not revealed any clinically significant findings, or hardly any clinically significant findings in the last decades. The reason must be that policymakers, lay people, and even some scientists perceive these methods to be more scientific and objective because they are based on such complicated technology. But as I have tried to argue here, this is not really the case. If we want to make the diagnosis of mental disorders better and more objective, we don't need neuroscience, we need psychology. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus, for this opening statement, and the opposing team now has the opportunity to cross-examine.
Thank you very much. Yes, so you mentioned reliability, and I would like to ask, what is your opinion about the reliability of symptoms, of judging symptoms or measuring them in some way, or just in diagnosis? There is quite some concern among clinicians and also patients that they get different diagnoses over 10 years, for example, from different clinicians, whereas their symptom pattern did not really differ so much. So how is that possible? And how can symptom research, if you just stick only with the symptoms, how can you then really make distinction about the causes of this illness?
Well, I think there are many questions there, but regarding reliability, it is indeed true that also psychological measures are not always very reliable, and we have similar problems there. But that's also kind of why my point is that we need to focus research on making those measures more reliable, because there is a lot that we can do also psychometrically and statistically to make assessments of psychological measures more reliable. For example, better defining the symptoms and what they are. Now they just come from some historical sources, but they are not really based on the top of the science. So I think we don't need to turn neuroscience, but need to find ways of making the psychological measures more reliable.
Yes, and you also mentioned some new methods which are indeed intriguing and very interesting. But the question is, have they delivered yet? Have they really improved clinical practice? Have the percentage of patients that really improve in their symptoms, is this a higher percentage nowadays than compared to when those methods were not around yet?
Well, that is of course a good question, but since I think the methods are so very new, it's too early to see how much they will help, and we just have to try to apply them and see what the results are. But I think many people are rather optimistic about it. And anyway, the same can be said about neuroscientific methods. What have they really done to help to treat people? And I think they're the answer. And they have been actually used for decades now, not just a couple of years, and they haven't really helped in treating people.
That's another question I wanted to ask, that the fact that neuroscience may not have been so successful as yet, does it mean that it by definition will not be able to do so? If you look at, for example, medical research in the field of cancer treatment, the first 20 years there was not so much progress, and the last 10 years there's been a lot of progress. So what do you think? Does it mean that there is no potential?
No, I don't mean that it's by definition impossible that we make progress, but the claim is rather that looking at the past track record, it doesn't look very promising, that because we have been expecting those breakthroughs all along from the beginning, and they just keep on being postponed.
One final very short question. Are you a Cartesian dualist? Because you say we stick with psychology, not neuroscience, but if it affects our thinking and our feelings, which organ in our body is responsible for that?
No, I think it's based in the brain, but the brain is as such too complex to directly study mental disorders at that level, and that's why we need psychology. So I'm not a Cartesian dualist.
With this answer, we end the opening statements from either team, and we continue with a statement from the team in favor of the proposition by Johanna Dinkelacker.
Thank you. Why do we go to the doctor or to the psychologist? We go there because we have a problem, and we have the hope that he will deliver us the perfect treatment based on our diagnosis. However, in mental disorders, there's the problem that patients with the same diagnosis differ extremely in their treatment response. So one patient might respond very well to a certain treatment, but another patient with the same diagnosis is not going to respond at all, or even just experience the side effects. So in the moment, the clinicians have the difficult situation that they have a patient with a diagnosis, and they have to choose between different treatment options, psychotherapy, medications, and they can only base their treatment decision on general statistics. So for example, they know in 60% of all patients this medication works well, but they don't know, is it going to work for this patient? Is it going to work for him or for her? So let me introduce you patient Mo. This case was described in an article in Science. Mo worked in a technology company, he had many friends, he loved music when his depression started. He got worse with sleep problems and panic attacks, and finally he lost his job. He went to the doctor, to the psychologist, and depression was diagnosed. He got medications which work well for many people, but it didn't work for Mo. So he was really desperate, and he decided to participate in a huge treatment study. There they used neuroimaging to classify different subtypes of depression. So in the case of Mo, they figured out, so based on this subtype, they offered a specific treatment. In the case of Mo, they figured out that his activation in the reward circuits were really low, and they offered him a specific medication treating this aspect. So after some weeks, he felt way better than he had in years, and his amazement for music began again. So what actually helped more the clinicians here? The key was the precise diagnosis, but also including neuroscientific findings for making the treatment individualized and effective. In general, research indicated in depression that by including genetic and clinical indications or markers, it was possible to predict the outcome for different medications. So now the clinician had an indication which medication might work well for this patient, and it was not longer try and error. Another study showed in depression that by including neuroimaging, it was possible to predict the treatment outcome. It was possible to predict if cognitive behavioral therapy or the medication worked better for this patient. But in general, neuroscientific findings are not only helpful for depression for treatment outcome, but also in many other mental disorders. So, for example, in social anxiety disorder, it was possible to predict the outcome of cognitive behavioral therapy by brain connectivity. Or in ADHD, by including biological markers, it was possible to differentiate between different subtypes, which respond differently to medication. Or even in schizophrenia, it was already possible to make first treatment predictions based on neural alterations. So, of course, these techniques need further development. However, by using neuroscientific techniques, clinicians can get more information about the precise subtype of the diagnosis and choose for the best treatment for this patient. So why shouldn't we include additional information by brain scans if we can help the patients to get the best treatment based on their precise diagnosis?
Thank you, Johanna. We continue with cross-examination from the team against the proposition.
Okay, thank you. So this is, as if I understood correctly, one case study. So I was wondering, is there evidence that this kind of approach would work also more generally, that you could put any kind of person into the scanner and then assign some cluster to that person, do the right treatment based on that scan? So does it work more generally, or is this just one example?
Yeah, like as I showed, in depression there were studies showing that, for example, this, including the genetic and clinical information, they had a predictive accuracy of 0.77 for the treatment response. Of course, not 100%, but more than 50% try and error.
Okay, and this person-specific approach, which is as such valuable, but we can of course also do it based on psychology. We can tailor treatments based on the psychological profile of the patient as well. We can divide them into clusters based on the psychological symptoms. So how much does the neural level really add to this picture?
Sure, and we don't say that we shouldn't include the psychological measures, and of course, especially the subjective experience is highly important. But I mean, these studies showed that we can have an additional value next to all the psychological measurement and the patient measurement, where we get even more information out that we didn't get before.
This is a kind of an additional added one thing that we add to the big picture, but also in the end, when we, for example, evaluate the success of these therapies, we again have to assess people on their psychological symptoms, right? So in the end, that seems to be still where we have to go. So this seems to be just one small piece in the big puzzle, and it's not like this is making the diagnosis objective as such, it's just adding something extra to predictability.
But you might say, what is the purpose of the diagnosis? And for me, I would say that the purpose of the diagnosis is highly related to the treatment as well. I mean, we do the diagnosis for offering a good treatment accordingly to the diagnosis. So if we can predict the treatment way better by including this information, I would say it adds objectivity to the full diagnosis as well.
Okay, so it adds a bit to the objectivity, but it doesn't as such make the diagnosis objective. No, it's not really a question.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you also for giving me a few seconds to remind each team that cross-examination is about asking questions, not making statements.
Oh, sorry.
Statements speaking of statements, we continue with a statement from Tom Yalling, who is speaking against this proposition.
Dear opponents, dear audience, I would like to oppose the story of Mo with the story of Johnny. Johnny also loved music, Johnny loved to do sports, but at a sudden moment he got this ache in his chest, started having trouble breathing, he started to drop to the floor because he was so lightheaded. But at the doctors they found nothing. Until the doctor said, you should go see a psychologist. You might have an anxiety disorder, hypochondria to be exact. Eventually, after the help with CBT, he was better again. So there was nowhere in this process where neuropsychology would have helped him further. Actually, it would have only given him more anxiety. I mean, we all know the stress of going to the hospital. We all know the stress of having to go into scans. Don't you think that this stress would also be visible in the brain? And I mean, it's not like anxiety and arousal are part of those disorders, right? Well, I mean, that's what they are. It creates a confounding variable. And I want to show this using a meta-study that has been done in 2017, using over 500 studies about neuropsychology. They found that the topography of OCD, major depression disorder, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorders is the same or almost similar. Basically, it means that all of these things can be found in the same spot. How can we accurately say that we have found the one thing? But let's go to a more ideal situation, one where we better know where it is and what the biological underpinnings are. I mean, it would still not mean that we have complete objectivity, because this research that we're doing towards neuropsychology is based on statistics. Still, a lot of statistics is subjective. For example, everyone knows the 0.05 threshold. It's still debated. We're still talking about it. We're still not sure that this is it. We don't have one objective threshold where we say this is it or where we found it. We're still debating it. Even Don van Ravenswaay, our own statistics lecturer, wrote articles on Mindwise about this threshold. He said, "It is a healthy and vibrant area of science that includes a number of cutting-edge topics about which some very smart people intensely disagree." I mean, if there's already a disagreement about the methods which we study this neuroscience, how can we even say that it is objective? Another problem that you will add up with this perceived objectivity is that the moment you put people in a scan and tell them, I'm sorry, your brain shows that you're depressed, your brain shows that you're anxious, they will be stigmatized. It is shown that people who have been diagnosed with the disorder sometimes have worse outcomes after the diagnosis because they deal with the self-fulfilling prophecy. For example, Johnny with his hypochondria, who now knew that he has hypochondria. It's in his brain, he can't do anything about it because it's in his brain. The moment he starts feeling bodily sensations, he's like, oh shit, no, I'm imagining this. No, it's not, no, it's something. This constant stress and fear will only be added up by this knowledge that he has hypochondria, that he will get only more anxious about it. We forget that when it's biological, it doesn't have to be objective. Because still, many people believe that the moment we say it's biological, you're done, that's it, that's your brain, I can't do anything about it. So what I would like to say is that we should focus on the symptoms instead of this biological underpinning. We should tell people that, hey, it's subjective, things can change, things can become better. It also gives people a sense of safety to know that it's not just your brain that's fucking up, it's also part of your life, it's part of all of our lives that we're anxious every now and then. Sometimes that we think we have a disease that we Google and then come out up with cancer or something like that. Overall, even if the neuropsychology were objective, it will potentially cause more harm. But it's not even objective. So why put the patients through this stress? That's it.
Thank you, Tom, for your colorful argument, and it's time for the other team to cross-examine.
Yeah, so my first question is about the statistics that you mentioned, and that you mentioned that there is disagreement about the statistics behind the neuroscientific techniques. And I was wondering, what are your opinions about the fact that also the questionnaires that are used in order to assess symptoms are developed through statistics and are also refined multiple times during decades, and also in that case, for instance, to measure one trait, you might have different questionnaires, and also in that case, there might not be agreement.
But I've never said that they were objective. That's, I think, in my eyes, the point. We're striving for objectivity, but in this case, objective is not possible. And sometimes it's better to then not have this objectivity from, for example, the neurofeedback to overcome stigmatization or something like that. So what we're debating here is, will neuroscience make it objective? No, I don't say that we make it objective, but I'm also saying that neuroscience doesn't make it objective.
And therefore, we have to rule out neuroscience?
Not necessarily rule out, I'm just saying it doesn't make it objective.
So you would still include neuroscience as a valid contribution to the diagnosis?
A valid contribution is very depending on case, on location. I think that we overestimate the usefulness of neuroscience in this case. I think, as Marcus said, we should focus more on the psychological part of it, try to make that better, and then maybe add neuroscience.
Okay. I have another question about the fact that you said that once you know that there's something in your brain, then you're stigmatized, right? However, related to that, I would like to say that in the DSM, there used to be included as a mental disorder homosexuality, which is clearly related to a stigma, and then it was removed. So I think the risk for being stigmatized also comes from the symptoms, or that's absolutely impossible in your opinion?
No, I do think that that stigmatization is still possible, definitely. But the moment that you know it's a brain disorder, so we have moved on past that point, and we have found out, hey, homosexuality, people are not suffering from it, so therefore it's not a disorder. We have perfectionized psychological methods, and that is also what I would like to point out. We keep perfectionizing. It's the same as you said, like, well, we perfectionizing neuroscience, so maybe in the future it's something. That's the same with psychological methods. We're still working on it.
Okay.
Thank you. We are coming to the closing stages of this formal debate with the closing statement from the team for this proposition by André Alleman.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have defended the proposition that neuroscience can make the diagnosis of mental disorders objective. So you can take away the question mark there. It can make the diagnosis objective. Arguments pro and con have been raised and exchanged. And in this final statement of the defense, I would like to point out two crucial aspects, facts that are undeniable and that fully support the statement that neuroscience can make the diagnosis of mental disorders objective. First, this proposition entails a promise, a future possibility. Neuroscience can, it has the potential to, it will most probably do, and make it more objective. And based on the successes of neuroimaging, this is fully justified. For example, neuroimaging has uncovered in the brain what happens when people hear voices. The brain activity has been very reliably established, overactivity in the language perception region, Wernicke's area. And even specific new treatments have been developed based on that, using magnetic brain stimulation of that specific area. Second, not only is there the possibility that neuroscience can improve and make diagnosis objective, there is already mounting evidence, accumulating evidence that supports this assertion. Machine learning, for example, has been applied to MRI scans at the University of Utrecht, And researchers were able to distinguish, based on the brain scans, bipolar disorder from schizophrenia. So they were able to classify patients having bipolar disorder or schizophrenia with an accuracy of 88%. This was published in the journal Neuroimage by Hugo Schnack and colleagues. Now, this is not a trivial issue in clinical practice. Many clinicians indicate that it's difficult for them sometimes to distinguish between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. And it's important to do so because the treatment is different. Manic episodes can have psychotic features, and then it can be difficult to know if this is a psychotic disorder or not. So it matters to know this, and there's good reason to think that neuroscience will refine its methods further in the near future, and it will make diagnosis more objective or even totally objective. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. There's no cross-examination in the closing statements, so we move immediately to Sander Woudewijn's closing statement.
Thank you. Thank you. Ladies, gentlemen, to close this part of the evening, I will now show how neuroscience in diagnostics cannot be objective. I will do this by arguing against its statistical significance, its statistical meaningfulness, and its statistical usefulness. As the other team has pointed out, there is a mountain of evidence for significant correlations between the firing of neurons and corresponding mental phenomena. Yet, as Marcus has pointed out, these results are not as replicable as implied, and these neurons can also be found in dead fish. Besides this, where the other team is certainly right in talking about significant differences between healthy and non-healthy populations, I would like to point out that the field of psychiatry itself came up with the criteria for these two populations. We ourselves have decided upon certain symptoms to belong to certain disorders, and in turn have verified these symptoms by pointing to pretty pictures in journal articles. If the criteria for the non-healthy population is decided upon by people, can significant neural evidence then even be objective? Underneath this idea of who is ill and who isn't are hidden values based on opinion. This can easily be exemplified by the status of homosexuality throughout the different versions of the DSM. Its status of being an illness, therefore belonging to the non-healthy population, has been erased. If culture and the people in it decide which symptoms belong to which mental disorders, how can these diagnoses then be objective? Can we even make objective conclusions about objectivity without understanding who decides who's healthy and who's ill? Neuroscience cannot make diagnostics objective because mental disorders aren't objective. This brings me to my next point. The meaningfulness of neuroscientific evidence on mental disorders. As a significant difference in brain scans between two groups of people does not tell us anything about causal understanding of these symptoms. Imagine if we were ever able to find biomarkers, biological underpinnings for example, anxiety. How do we then know this firing of neurons is a sign of anxiety disorder and not merely of the anxiety of being put into a noisy fMRI tube? Adding to this, reducing psychological symptoms to the level of biology does not tell us anything about the scale of the symptom on a psychological level. Do we assume the firing of neurons to cause the same amount of suffering in every person? It seems highly undesirable for me to draw conclusions on someone's well-being based on firing neurons without knowing how these firing of neurons make someone feel. All in all, I would conclude brain scans to not be useful for diagnosing mental disorders because we are not measuring experience. What are we measuring in neuroscience? Imagine 10 people in a room. No matter how accurate you could measure the oxygen consumed in this room, you will not be able to differentiate the following states. 5 people with red hats sleeping while 5 people with blue hats are on the treadmill. Or 5 people with blue hats sleeping while 5 people with red hats are on the treadmill, and so on. In order to understand what is actually going on in this room, we need to know which people are sleeping or exercising and why. Measuring gross oxygen consumption won't tell us that. The underlying scientific principle of things like fMRI is that inferences can be made due to indirect observation of changes in blood flow. Consequently, scans completely overlook all the parts of the mind that do not correspond to changes in blood flow. If we ourselves decide which symptoms belong to which mental disorders, and in turn try to prove these mental disorders by pointing at blood flow, we are not being objective.
Time.
Thank you.
It's perfect timing, actually, to thank all of our debaters before we move on with the second part of this debate. Thank you all very much. As promised at the beginning of this debate, we now open up the discussion to the entire room, to all of you. Kirsten is going to be walking around with a microphone, and I have only one request. Wait until you, well, 2 requests actually. Wait until you receive the microphone, and if you have a question for a specific person, please tell us what that person is, or if it's for a specific team, tell us which one this team is. So, we have a gentleman here in the front.
Yes, my question, I guess, is for everybody in a way, but more for the people that are arguing for it. So I believe that it can be helpful to get hints from brain scans, maybe to see that there might be a psychological disorder. But I think it might be interesting to also look at, okay, what do we do in the absence of finding results from these scans? Because there can be an example where, like, a psychologist, I think that happened at some point, he tried to get into mental hospital himself by feigning symptoms, right? So in that case, then a neuroscan where you see, okay, there's no results, that might be helpful to see, okay, he's lying. But what if there is a person where the brain scan doesn't show anything? Do we then just assume that this person is lying by default? How do we deal with that? How do we deal with the subjective experience of the person if the brain scan is not showing anything? I hope you understood what I mean.
Well, the point here is that you want to get to a high level of specificity and sensitivity. So these scans that I just mentioned had an accuracy of 88%, meaning that they may still make some errors, but they can greatly help a clinician in making a diagnosis. So with further refinement, we might get up to a higher percentage. That's quite likely. First, because those methods are quite crude nowadays. They can be refined. Everyone agrees on that. And second, because if you have a mental disorder, something is wrong with your way of thinking or feeling, otherwise it's not disordered. So it is impossible, from a theoretical point of view, that there is no change in your brain. So the only thing can be that we cannot measure it because of a lack of sensitive instruments, and then we have to develop those. But as long as we are not totally certain that we can measure it 100% accurate, we should be very careful by having full certainty. But the situation nowadays is much and much worse than that. So now the certainty is nowhere. As I hear from the opponents, they said mental disorders are not objective anyhow. So we want to, I would say, to go to more objectivity.
Before we, do you have a follow-up? Is that
No, just because you said, okay, we need to refine the methods. Do you think that we might arrive at a point where we can tell a patient that is coming and is complaining about symptoms, and we look at the scan, we say, no, you don't have anything, you go home with 100% certainty? Because I think that's what we're talking about when we talk about objectivity in that sense, right? And that's, I think, also what you said we could go towards to, and I agree that maybe we can approximate that, but at what point do we know we've reached that point, right? And how on the way until we know we reach that point do we deal with the people that do have symptoms, but we do not find anything. I think that is the core question. I agree we can approximate again, but do you think we'll reach this point where we can just say, hey, go home, you don't have anything?
Well, I think it's possible in some respects, because what we would like to do is to look at single processes that might be disordered. So this is also a project in the US. For example, in ADHD there may be different forms, and some forms maybe especially have to do with a lack of inhibition. So you cannot inhibit your urges that you have. And if someone comes to a neuroscientist and says, I cannot inhibit myself in any way and my thoughts, we now already have pretty good tasks to measure that in the brain scanner, and if we can see that you do very fine on those tasks, then we can quite confidently say that, well, it may not be such a big problem for you. And then, like memory, we have a lot of, almost everyone who is 65 plus or also 40 or 50 plus complains about memory deterioration. So my memory is worse than it was. We have already objective tests for that. You don't even need neuroimaging, you just only need neuropsychology. And we can tell people, well, your memory still is quite good if you do the testing. And then those are reliable tests, and it is good, your memory. So I think to some extent this could be possible in the future, but it will not be about, we have to get rid of these broad categories like depression and schizophrenia, which are way too broad, and we have to go to what someone has difficulties in functioning, which process is going wrong. Is it inhibition? Is it something else? And look to that more specifically.
Before our next question, can I ask for a point of clarification? And Andre, in the study that you were describing with the 88% correct rate in classifying between bipolar and schizophrenia, you said, was this a two alternative task with chance 50%?
So this was based on structural scans, so they didn't have to do anything in the scanner. And what they did after training the support vector machine, the computer so to say, they fed in new scans of a new person, and the computer was quite accurate in saying this must be bipolar disorder or this must be schizophrenia, based on the previous scans in the database.
Okay, thank you. More questions? There's a question right there.
Thank you all for the interesting discussion. My question is, my naive mind says that the moment you walk into a hospital to make any kind of exam, you're probably gonna walk out with medicine. So is one of the sides more connected to the treatment, pushing the patients to go for a medical treatment or not?
Who is this question for?
Anyone?
Who would like to take this question first?
Well, I can say something. Yeah, so I think our team was kind of neutral on that matter, but in general I think the medicines are not as effective as they seem, and only some disorders have really good medication for it. So actually what helps usually better is psychosocial interventions and talk therapy and that kind of stuff. And there's also a lot of research there to do to improve those kind of methods. So I think that's a more promising route than trying to find new medications, which hasn't really worked because we also haven't found any new medication in the last 20 years or so, despite it has been tried really hard.
Should I add something to that?
Please.
So I would say no side is arguing for more medication or less medication. And I would say even by adding neuroscientific findings, you have more predictions what kind of psychotherapy could be useful as well, because there are large differences as well. And it's not argumenting for more medications, it's more argumenting for having a more precise approach to this person. And this can include psychotherapy quite well.
Yes, because psychotherapy also changes your brain. So there are many studies showing that similar changes sometimes as medication.
Yeah, especially the brain circuits.
There's a question here.
So a question for you. Don't you think that also, I mean, you say, okay, we can personalize treatment more using neuroscience, but is it not more logical first to try to personalize on the other level? And I don't mean just symptoms, but also do people, for example, with depression have sleep problems? Do they ruminate? Is there something that they're not moving enough, and personalize psychological treatments based on that? We don't need very complicated neuroscience to personalize.
So I would say that I'm not arguing that we shouldn't include that. Of course, we need all these psychological measures as well. But in the moment, we have the problem that based on the symptoms, the categories are so broad that even by including aspects like sleep problems or rumination or stuff like this, it is not the treatment is not really, in the most cases, not really targeted to these psychological symptoms, because it's many times quite difficult to match it perfectly. So I would say that we need neuroscientific findings as well, because maybe they are going to give us more hints to this. Like, I think it's one aspect, the psychological aspect and the neuroscientific aspect. And by using neuroscientific techniques, maybe we get more indications which psychological problem might be the key as well. For example, if we see that in the reward system we have problems, it's a psychological factor as well. And then this can be targeted.
But if you're looking for problems in the reward system, you can very easily look at or just observe people indeed with momentary assessment technology to see how much they enjoy daily life activities and get measures of how their reward experience is in terms of psychological terms. So you could differentiate people very well and connect it to treatments that match their psychological issues in daily lives. So I don't quite see how it could not match what you say, that these psychological things like sleep and movement or reward system do not match to symptoms. I don't quite mean or understand what you mean with that.
I would say to some extent, of course, yes. Of course we need, and I mean, we are not arguing against that we need more psychological measurement or integration. Of course we need this as well. And we are just saying that neuroscientific techniques contribute in an objective way, because these psychological measurements, as they pointed out, are really subjective, and patients might, for example, in some questions, people might be ashamed to answer honestly, and then so problems might be not detected really. So we just argue that it adds objectivity in this sense here. Yes, and what I mean? Yeah.
There are two questions behind you, Kirsten.
So the group 4 said that neuroscience can in the future be objective, and I think that we are all aware that science is going in the direction of quantum mechanics, and it has been shown that the tests can give different results depending on observer effect, which kind of shows that the tests are not really objective. How would you answer to that?
Who was this question for?
It's for the 4 team, but could also be turned against the against team.
I look at you. Do you have any comments or any responses to this question?
Well, the only thing I can say, because I asked this to a professor of quantum mechanics, because many people ask neuroscientists about quantum mechanics, but they don't know anything about it. So I asked it to a physics professor, and he told me quantum mechanics is at a very low level of matter, and it has nothing to do with the higher levels that you're studying. So that's the only answer he gave me, and I was fine with it. But I don't know if it's a good answer for your question.
Any comments on your side? There were some questions on the other side, Kirsten.
Well, thank you very much. The question is for the against team. The 4 team already stated that they believe that objectification is possible in the future, but I'm very curious, like for you guys over there, is objectification, do you think objectification of neuroscience is possible in the future? How do you look towards that? I'm curious about that. Thanks.
Well, I think
per definition, if we're talking about objectivity, we're trying to say something that goes beyond personal judgment, that is like somewhere out there in the external world, and we are there to simply find it. But what we are talking about right now is psychology, which is people studying people. And for me, therefore, the idea should not be to have an objective view on mental disorders, diagnostics, or whatever, because inherently we're talking about people. And they are not objective, they are subjective, literally.
This is, I should point out, this is the part of the discussion where each team can sort of relax its black and white opinions to and find some space for a little bit more nuance if such a thing is desirable by any of the 6 of you. So don't be restrained by your positions at these 2 tables, but find more the interests of the audience in your arguments. Any responses from either side to this? Not to my statement, but to Xander's statement, I should say. In that case, we continue with more questions. I think there are questions over there in the back, to your right, Kirsten. I think they were first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think the most controversial word in this debate is this objectivity. And so what I'm wondering is like, so both group, or as mainly the 4 group, take this word to be objective as a synonym or like close to be reliable or close to the truth. But so why do we have so different words for it? So is it like objective more reliable, or why do we have also a subjective view of the things? So should we really stress the reliability of the objectivity, or can we again discuss if also the subjective aspect of a diagnosis of a disorder has its own weight in the truth or in the reliability of the diagnosis?
So, what does it mean here to be objective? Is it about reliability, and where does the subjectivity come in? What is the answer? I guess the first you want the team for the proposition to answer?
Well, imagine that you have 3 different disorders, A, B, and C, and that if you would ask a big panel of 100 psychologists to judge a patient on his or her symptoms, they would be right. So we imagine the panel is right, 100 psychologists. So you have disorders A, B, or C. And then this person goes to one psychologist, he says, you have A. Then he goes, and you need a certain treatment. Then he goes to another psychologist, says, you have disorder B, another treatment, different treatment. Then he goes finally to another psychologist, he says, you have disorder C, gets another treatment, and now it works. Would he have gone to the panel? They would have said, this is C, because the panel is always right. Then it matters, the objectivity, because the first 2 were wrong, and it was a problem for the patient because it took him much longer to recover, and he had all kinds of nasty treatments that he didn't like. So that's why I think objectivity matters, because there are disorders. I don't think they are in our minds, they really exist.
I'm not talking about the objectivity. It's not about the objectivity of the tester. It's like because what we measure with neuroscience, we say it is more objective because we have some measures that goes beyond the subjective experience of the patients. So in that way, I say that I think I interpret that you claim that neuroscience can make it more objective, not because of different psychologists can say different things, but because we have the symptoms in the brain, so we don't have to rely on the subjective experience of the patients. So it's not about what the psychologists say, it's about what do we measure, what the patient say or his brain. This is what I meant.
Yes, I understand. Well, in this case, the hope is that the brain scans could help there and could tell us more, because many patients have difficulty explaining or talking about their symptoms, especially if you are talking about psychotic patients. So if a brain scan could be of help there, it would make it easier for everyone to know what's going on. But I also think there is a possible role for neuroimaging in, for example, depression. These days we have mindfulness approaches, mindfulness treatment, and there's quite some evidence from neuroscience that this has to do with the resting network. So if you're in rest, you're not doing anything in the brain scanner, you always get into the same network, the default mode network, everyone actually. It is a very reliable measurement, so it was criticized, the reliability, but fMRI has a very reliable measurement of the resting state. And the ability to get out of your resting state has to do with your mental flexibility. And if you're a mindful person, you're more able to get out of your resting state and to switch to other states. And there is some evidence and a lot of ideas about this, that in depression they have more difficulty to get out of this ruminating, or how you call it, resting state. And therefore mindfulness approaches might help, because they train you to get out of that state. So it may be possible with brain scans to measure to which extent people have difficulty getting out of that state. And it may be very difficult to ask them about it or to measure it with lists or symptoms or things like that, I would say.
Hi. I had a question for Tom. I liked about your statement that you look at the impact on the patient and the stigmatization. Now I had a question about if it has the opposite effect. So for the people who believe, no, this psychologist, it's his opinion, if neuroscience could make the diagnosis more objective from the patient point of view, so you would accept the diagnosis more in a sense.
Yeah, I do think that that's definitely possible, because people will see this objectivity as, hey, this is objective, this is a reliable method, so therefore this must be the right diagnosis. In that way, I do think it does less harm, but I am aware of the fact that it's also the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
And so far, most of the articles that I've read mostly go that way. So they mostly go into the stigmatization instead of the opposite way. But that might also be a bias in research.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't aware of the percentage of stigmatization versus I don't believe your diagnosis. Thank you.
Somebody here in the front.
Thank you. I actually have a point about objectivity and its role in confirming the diagnosis, because I've heard, I think it was your point, that it is always, mental disorder is always a subjective thing per se, because it's happening inside a patient. However, I would argue that, for instance, if you take a patient with schizophrenia, subjectively, this patient might never really accept his or her mental disorder as a problem, which is also the case with many other disorders, especially in severe cases, such as somatized depression, for instance. So I really see that if we rule out the objective measures of how else to prove that person has some kind of disorder, we face a problem where a patient who is suffering might never go to the doctor in the first place and admit that this might be the suffering happening. And also I wanted to, I remember there were studies on zebrafish, which are used also as models for some, well, more primitive kinds of mental disorders to test the drugs. And it's very easy to observe certain behaviors such as anxiety or depression in the fish by their behavior. So they have very different patterns of how they move around the fish tank. And I would say that this is a pretty measurable, very reliable thing, because you can easily distinguish one kind of unusual behavior from the other. So do you think that if we perfect our methods of how we observe or measure the behavior of people, we could also get the same results? Or for instance, if we want to measure the severity of the disorder, we might also measure the the firing neurons might fire with a very different pace, with a different pattern, for instance, in different neural circuits. So do you think that it could actually be a possibility to, in the future, maybe not the nearest future, to make it objective?
I can say something about your first point, not about the second. So you mentioned indeed cases of people behaving in certain ways that we feel like are very unusual, but they themselves not suffering from it, or they themselves not acknowledging it. And that's a really interesting case, I think, because insofar as we assume that someone has a disorder if they're suffering and their personal experience is not like suffering, then we could start looking at our societal norms of when someone is usual or unusual. It leaves at least room to start thinking of where we, from what point on we assume deviance from the norm, and to what sense we're simply very intolerant of people behaving in certain ways.
I can try to answer the second question about the fish. So there's indeed a lot of interesting stuff done on animal models like fish and rats, but I would say that there's a huge distance from a zebrafish kind of changing its color to, for example, a human being anxious about the social interaction and so on. So that gap from the zebrafish set up to the humans, that's still a huge gap to cross, and we don't really know if we're even talking about the same thing. So in that sense, yeah, it might be in the far future, but not at the moment.
Kirsten, there's a gentleman in the front row behind.
Good evening, everyone, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for this discussion. My question is, I guess my question is related to the topic of the discussion that, we ask that can neuroscience make the diagnosis of mental disorders subjective? But from my point of view, there was maybe too much focus on just one data, which is fMRI, which is brain scans, and we're totally missing other kind of data that is generated by the tools that are here because of neuroscience. For example, some some computer tools that can diagnose you with particular disease, like Parkinson, for example. Don't you think that we when we discuss neuroscience, that we should be also discussing this type of data, not just fMRI scans? And the second point is that when I think about being I don't know, psychiatrist or psychologist, I guess the kind of data that you are getting from patient is his reaction to the questions that you ask him or her. And don't you think that at some point we would have such computer tools that would be able to find patterns in the speech and do the better job than the actual humans? Thank you.
This is for the team against the proposition, right? So
I definitely think that there's way more than just the fMRI. I think just for the sake of we need to put this into 5 minutes every time, and fMRI is the most well-known neuro psychology use that people know of. But yeah, we also have EEG, studying hormones, everything. It's definitely, there are definitely tools that will help us further, that will help us reach a more objective diagnosis or more objective results. I do think that if you would, for example, use it in diagnosis, if you would add them all together, the process would be very long. It would be a very thin. So it's sometimes also important to focus on just one of the parts of the whole, to perfectionize it, to make it better, to create just a few tools that will help you further than the sum of all of them, just out of efficiency. And the second part was about the studying of, for example, the speech behavior. I think it goes in line with the zebrafish, that I think definitely with creating the right programs, finding the right patterns in speech, in behavior, in sleeping patterns, in maybe even thinking patterns, we could definitely do that. Especially on the rise of we are getting better computers, we're getting better processors, we're growing further and further into the field of technology. With the use, for example, of AI, we can get way further in studying patterns and finding those the biological underpinnings of those patterns or the symptoms in line with those patterns.
Thank you, Tom. There was a question here with a... That's it. Perfect. Thank you.
Mag ik? Mr. Aleman, you asked a question about dualism to Mr. Eronen. Am I right to assume that you are not a dualist, but a materialist?
No, no. I am a so-called dual aspect monist.
Andre, I think you'll have to explain this for my sake.
Being monist means that you see the brain-mind as one thing, if you can call it a thing or an entity. So it's one entity. But dual aspect monist means that you see two sides to it, being the brain and the mind. And they are not reducible to each other. So you could compare it to, I don't know how you say this in English, a piece of embroidery. I don't know if everyone understands it. If you see an artwork of embroidery, you have two sides, and the back side looks rather ugly because it's where all the how do you call it? Stitches are, and the front side can be very beautiful. So the front side is the mind, in my opinion, and the back side is the brain. If you change really big things in the back side, you will change things in the front side. So there's a direct relationship. But nonetheless, and it's one thing also, but nonetheless you will put one side on the wall because it has more meaning and you can talk at another level about it. So I do acknowledge that the psychological level is a level in its own right, and there's nothing wrong with only studying psychological phenomena. But I also do think that if you really want to know that how does this work or why is this like this, you could switch perspectives and look at the backside, and that's the neuroscience.
Maybe I can take some time for myself to ask a question to clarify something on this. Andre, if my experience with embroidery is limited to primary school, but if I remember correctly, it's possible for embroidery to alter the reverse side without altering the front and vice versa. It's possible to have the same pattern in the back and a different pattern in the front and vice versa. And I'm sure somebody will contradict me because, as I said, my embroidery skills are not perfect. But in this analogy, isn't it also possible to change aspects in the brain but not change aspects in the mind or in the behavior and vice versa?
Yes, I definitely think that's possible. But I also think it is up to a certain extent. So for a certain behavior to occur or a certain consciousness to have a thought in your mind, you may need a concerted activity of millions of neurons. And if 10,000 of them would do something else, maybe you wouldn't notice any difference. But if 10,000 very crucial neurons in some area that is very important for this task would change, then you may notice a difference. So it depends on which kind of change. So nowadays it's a bit fashionable to say that there can be multiple instantiation in the brain, and brain regions can do a lot of things, which to some extent is true because we are talking about very big regions. But I think you should be careful because there's a lot of evidence that brain regions like language production and all kinds of other processes are really tied to certain circuits, and it's really quite precisely mapped, and it works like that in most people.
Thank you. I think there's a question here at the front.
I would like to shift the attention for a second to depression and to depression in real life. Most people become depressed because of something. At least you could say their depression has some kind of subjective content, right? It's very hard to imagine a depression without any subjective feeling, because that's the core of what we think is depression. Well, consider, for instance, a woman who is in a dysfunctional relationship and she's beaten by her husband and she doesn't dare to flee the relationship. After a while, the only reason for her, or the only way out for her, is to become depressed. She cannot stand up to her husband, etc. Well, when you listen to such a story, most stories of depression are something like this. A patient often has some kind of story, subjective story behind it. What I don't understand from the neuroscience people is, first of all, is it desirable to make this a more objective field, and why? Or could we just stay in the subjective area? Because I don't have to see her brain in order to recommend to her, you should get away from this husband. The question.
Yeah, I see your point, and I think it's a valid one, and we never claimed, well, in our most extreme phase of the debate, that we should get rid of the subjective experience of the patient. It's more about understanding also what is going on in the brain, because for sure we can expect at least that there is some connection between what's happening in terms of feelings and in terms of experience, and also what's happening in terms of the brain functioning of this person. And I think it's not necessarily bad to also look at the person's brain in this case, which doesn't mean, and I think it would be, very absurd to think that we should just look only at the brain and not care about the story of the patient. And of course, we are always interacting with some sort of environment, so that's for sure to be taken into account. But I think the brain can provide some useful insights, also given that, as the other team argued, the categories for the diseases are also subjective and are changing. So maybe we could get some insights from the brain to understand also how these categories work. But of course, it's not a matter of just the brain or just the subjective experience.
Well, if I may add something, so mental disorders are brain disorders. That's a kind of statement that was also made in the flyer. Some people take this as meaning that brain disorders, that they're the primary cause, meaning the first cause in time, is in the brain. And then, of course, many depressions, I think it's very difficult to argue that the first cause was in the brain, because the example you gave is clearly not in the brain. But at the end, if you're for a long time in a very chronic stressed situation, it will affect your brain. And I can imagine that in your example, if your solution, which is leaving that husband, I can still imagine that her depression is not immediately gone away. And she might even be depressed for 1 or 2 years, or who knows how long. So then it still is unclear if the brain was not affected, or it's not important to take it into account. And of course, treatments don't need to be at the brain level directly, because all kinds of other treatments can also affect your brain in a positive way. But what I see in depressed people is that they also have different kind of treatments, and there was even a professor of psychiatry who got depressed and all kinds of treatments didn't work, and then at the end they prescribed him an old tricyclic antidepressant and it worked very well. So if neuroscience could help make this a faster procedure to find out the good treatment for you, that would be very nice. But I have to admit it's still a promise, and hopefully it will deliver at some point.
There's a question here.
Yes, I have a question about the implications of focusing on neuroscience, because I feel like there's a lot of tendency to favor science, maybe, or like hard science towards psychology. And I was wondering for what either of the teams thinks that the implications are for an increased focus on neuroscience, and what would happen in those cases where we might not be yet at the point where we can reliably rely on neuroscience. Because at the end of the day, I do agree with you with what you said, that psychology is people studying people. And if we might come to a point where we no longer trust humans, but just trust neuroscience and take away the understandings that humans need to analyze the data, for example.
Well, I might start. So I think one important implication is about the sense of agency that people have. So if we start to excessively talk about mental disorders as brain disorders, then people might get the feeling that there's little that they can do about their mental disorder. And there are studies, for example, about gambling disorder, which is nowadays often seen as a brain disorder. Then people think, look, I have this thing in my brain and I just can't stop gambling and I cannot do anything about it, or maybe I have to take some medication. But if you treat it more as a psychological thing, then it kind of opens the space for more like psychological and social interventions and treatments.
Somebody wanted to contribute something, but I wasn't sure who said that. Please.
Thank you very much. As far as I've seen around in this country and elsewhere, I think that often, if I may express this remark, that conditions often are confused with situations, and that conditions are the consequence often of situations, social situations, for example. And another point I would like to make is, isn't it, or is it real that a lot of medical staff everywhere thinks or pretends that everything is known already? That's a big mistake, I'm afraid. In most sciences, most things are not yet known. So, and a third point, please, I would make or would like to remark is that Roger Penrose, the former Nobel Prize winner in physics, launched the suggestion years ago already that part of our thinking might be based or caused by a kind of radio waves or something within our own brain, which propagate themselves much faster than our nerves in our brains are able to, so that it might be some flash of a millisecond before we are able to put things in words or express ourselves consciously, then certain messages might spread around already from one center to the other. So that might be also interesting to think about how rapidly we can partly become conscious of things. Yeah,
Thank you. I saw that there was possibly a response there in the back, or
I would perhaps try to give an example what he was trying to say. I'm trying. Anyways, in 2016, there was immense suicide crisis in one of the Native American reservoirs in Canada, which is called, I think, Atawapiskat. I'm not, yeah, anyways. And during a really short period of time, there were hundreds of suicide attempts across generation, like age groups, and the town size itself was 2,000 people. Okay. We see from this type of behavior in a community that it's systematic. It has colonial reasons and da-da-da-da-da. So we can easily explain why people who have lost their cultural background might be suicidal. But would we make the same conclusion about the systematic issue while looking at the brain scans of these people or analyzing individually what causes the suicide? In parallel, we could think about depression, how the rates have been increasing, the prevalence, the distribution, and we can also sort of contemplate about a systematic cause in society. And that makes me doubt whether this sort of delusional obsession with objectivity and diagnosing mental disorders that are clearly systematic in society, a response to system, which is of course easier in the Native Americans groups to sort of reason. My question therefore is, taking into account these things, can possibly neuroscience, with its objectivity claims, account for systematic causes? And if not, then would our future be just everybody's prescribed a soma that makes us happy and we can go on with our lives? Thank you.
I'll give both teams the chance to answer this, starting with your team.
Well, I think it's fully acknowledged and should be acknowledged that there are cultural influences on all kinds of behaviors. So it is possible that people become suicidal, for example, in a certain environment influenced by other people, and they may not have a disorder in their brain at that moment. That's I think, perfectly possible. So I think that any psychologist or psychiatrist making a diagnosis, also in the future, will always have to speak to the person extensively and take all other factors into account. So you cannot just blindly make a scan and make a decision on that. That would be my more nuanced position than maybe before.
More from your team, or shall I give the microphone to the other side?
You can give it in the meantime.
Okay.
So you were also talking about the system, how it's systematically, as Dr. Aleman already said, if you are for a prolonged time in a certain state of mind, for example, depression, or even this feeling of loss of culture, it will affect your brain at one point. And especially when something's systematic, it's more easy to observe, more easy to look at. And for example, the brain scans in this case might be able to help out to find where the systemization is coming from. You can maybe start to target the groups and see if they all share the same biological underpinnings or not. For example, in these Native Canadians, was there a biological underpinning that they all shared the same neurofiring under the circumstances where they were suicidal. I think especially with that systemization, you might be able to find with neurofeedback this systemization, this pattern, and a possible underpinning for it.
Any other statements from either team?
Yes. We live in a society. I'm kidding. But I do believe indeed that too big of a focus on neuroscience could kind of make us blind to this society, or at least give us this really laser point focused on an individualistic idea, and maybe even place too much personal responsibility on the reason wherefore someone is suffering. And therefore we need stories, people's stories.
But I would say that, for example, there's a new approach in the US, and then their idea is, they say that the symptom categories in the moment are too broad, because patients are really different within this category, and they try to measure more things, but they don't only measure neuroscience, because of course this is not going to reflect the personal subjective experiences. That's not going to reflect many aspects what make the disease so specific. They also include life experiences, they include behavioral processes, and I think that by I think we were really right when the man before said that we don't know anything, like we don't know a lot about mental disorders in the moment, and I think we have to all start together from different angles, from a societal angle, from a biological angle, from different angles, to work together now to figure out more about the mental disorders, and these include all these aspects.
Thank you. I think this is a good time to give a break to this very interesting discussion, and for us to try to wrap up for the time being. I always try to bring some of the elements of this discussion in a closing statement, and it's always a little bit difficult for me. So I have my notes, and they're slightly meandering, so you'll have to give me a little bit of leeway on this. We've heard a lot of interesting cases and case studies and very fascinating arguments from both teams, and indeed from the audience, and I thank everybody for this, for today. It seems to me that at the core of this issue are definitions of what we mean by clinical disorders, of how we understand what these clinical disorders are, what they're linked to what their physiological basis may be, or how we understand this physiological basis to be, but also in general about this idea of objectivity. On a number of occasions today, the idea of objectivity and the specific nature of objectivity and our definition of objectivity was called into question, and I think this is also very much at the core of this matter. In thinking about what it means for something as culturally complex, at least culturally complex, as a psychological disorder to be understood, we also need to understand the complexity of this vast universe that is the brain, and the very little that we still understand about it, but at the same time the great promise we have about understanding it to a much greater degree in the future. And the counterpoint, of course, to this is that as neuroscience improves, as our scanning power improves, as all of these very interesting and expensive and well-funded techniques improve, so does our understanding and our definitional power of these psychological disorders, and indeed the psychological techniques that are then used to measure them. And it seems to me that at least until such disorders are more, let's call it, objectively defined in terms of their symptomatology, in terms of the behaviors that they reflect, and I'll leave you to think about what it means for these things to be more objectively defined. As captivating and charming and beautiful as neuroscience is, it still remains to a large extent subjective, or in this kind of picture that I have behind me and in front of you, there still remains a lot of subjectivity in how we interpret these brain scans. We've also heard about links to statistical limitations, and this is, I think, a very fascinating discussion, but I think it belongs to a different debate, perhaps another Mindwise debate, so keep checking your social media for this. There's a couple of other points that I noticed and I wanted to comment on. We talked a lot about diagnosis, but not too much about treatment and how neuroscience can help with this, and whether treatment can be assisted or whether it's hindered, and whether psychological definitions or understandings of treatments are better. The other thing that we also talked about is reliability. A lot of mentions were made on reliability, but I didn't hear the word validity in any of the hour and a half that passed. And this is something that concerns me, because a lot of the times when we think about brain activity and the physiological basis of behaviors, we are talking about behaviors. We do ground the physiological manifestation of our brain into behaviors that are, by definition, to a large extent, subjective. And maybe I can end with this. Also, somebody mentioned about suffering. This also has problems when it comes to definitions of objectivity and subjectivity. What was it? Somebody told me a couple of days ago, pain is, life is pain, but suffering is optional. Nice. I'd like to end this event today by doing two things. First, inviting those of you who still want to engage with the members of the two debate teams and perhaps with each other to join us for a short drink at the very least at Cordegar, which is a bar just around the corner. Here's a map in front of you. I would like to invite you to participate either as debaters or as audience members in future debates that we have. And finally, I would like to ask all of you to thank our members of the two debate teams one more time, and thank you very much for being here today.